Thank you for joining us. This is great to see such a packed audience. I'm Mike Lenz. I'm the Associate Faculty Director of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and I also teach in urban planning. Many of you here are from urban planning, and you probably already know some of that. It's a super exciting honor to have Ann Owens here today, to have Ann Owens here virtually every day at UCLA or every day she makes it. Um, and, I'm like, I've known Ann forever. Why should I read from some formal bio? And then I started reading her bio. I was like, I don't know some of this cool stuff. So I am going to read some of these cool things in addition to being professor of sociology here at UCLA. Ann's research centers on the causes and consequences of social inequality. She focuses on neighborhoods, housing, education, and geographic and social mobility. That's all a bunch of stuff I did know, but it's well packaged. Thank you for that, Ann. Ann is a sociologist by training and by faculty here at UCLA, but a lot of her work has a lot of relevance, I think, for policymakers and for planners and planning scholars. Ann is a recipient of many awards. I won't embarrass her with all of them, but I will note that she is the 2022 William Julius Wilson Early Career Award winner from the ASA, or American Sociology Association. That's kind of like the MVP and Rookie of the Year all wrapped in one amongst U.S. sociologists or from a U.S. Sociology Association. That seems pretty impressive. And co-leads the segregation tracking project, I believe at Stanford, or co-leads the segregation tracking project. So lots of segregation data happening there. She's the co-editor of the journal City and Community, which is something that many of you have possibly read some articles from there. A lot of great overlap in that journal between housing policy, urban policy, and sociology. Okay. Today, Ann is going to be discussing some of her research on the low-income housing tax credit program, and a lot, connected to all these sorts of things that I've been talking about already: neighborhoods, inequality, where people are located, and that's all for me. Take it away, Ann.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Mike for, I wasn't sure where that intro was going, but thank you for that wide-ranging introduction. And thank you so much for the invitation to talk today to Georgie and Whitney and everyone at the Lewis Center who got us set up and got us delicious lunch. It's really a delight to be here today. So I'm going to sort of take you through, I'm going to do a bad model of how to give a talk, which is I'm going to throw like 6 papers in here. So just bear with me. But just sort of an ongoing research agenda I have on the low-income housing tax credit program. So just to start with kind of key facts that animate some of my work, which is not surprising, I'm sure, to anyone in this room. Newsflash, housing is unaffordable, especially for low-income households. So this is just the most recent figures from the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies annual report, and the bars are showing us the percent of renter households that are either moderately rent burdened, which means they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs, or severely rent burdened, which means they're spending over half their income on rent and utilities. And the logic of this metric is if you're rent burdened, you're paying so much in housing, you don't have enough left over to cover kind of the rest of your essentials. So over 80% of all low income renters, but also over half of all renters were rent burdened in the US, and there's been some increase in that prevalence over time. The second thing I think about a lot is that neighborhoods matter for children's futures. So this is just one illustration. This is a map of Los Angeles from the Opportunity Insights project created by Raj Chetty and colleagues. And the map is shaded by the income earned in young adulthood by low-income children that grow up in these neighborhoods. And so red indicates lower earnings and blue indicates higher earnings. And so there's a huge difference, which if many of us, I assume, are local. If you have maybe a hypothesis about LA neighborhoods, maybe this isn't surprising, but there's a huge difference between growing up in sort of central, south central LA, where the predicted adult income was less than $30,000 versus growing up in the coastal communities, SGV, other more inland areas where the predicted income is more than double that. And adult earnings is just one example. We know from like a century of sociological and social science research that neighborhood residence during childhood predicts future health, criminality, educational attainment, lots of life outcomes, especially for poor kids. So to kind of bring these 2 points together, housing is potentially one factor that affects who can live where. Low-income and racially minoritized families often cannot access these more advantageous areas because housing costs there are too high. And to be clear, there's lots of other important factors that predict where folks end up living in terms of their own preferences, their incomes, discrimination, lots of other things. But today I'm focusing on the role of housing supply. So as I said, I'm currently working on, several projects that assess whether federally subsidized affordable housing policy in the US as one source, not the only source, obviously, of housing supply for low-income families is kind of exacerbating or reducing inequality and access to affordable housing in these potentially advantageous neighborhoods. So this is just a map of the location of affordable housing developments built through the low-income housing tax credit program, which I'm going to talk a lot about today. And you can see that they're sort of concentrated in the areas that were shaded red in that previous map. So, they're sort of providing access to neighborhoods that might not produce kind of the most advantageous outcomes, at least in terms of adult earnings. So what I'm going to do today is take you through more about this program, who it serves, where it's located, with sort of an eye throughout towards evaluating its potential or risk as a problem or solution to some of these pressing affordability and access issues. I'm a sociologist, so we sit very quietly and politely, and then at the end we ask a lot of questions, but I know this is a multidisciplinary audience, and so if you have a question that is clarifying, feel free to jump in. If I don't think it's clarifying, I will tell you to hold it. Okay, so just to, again, probably I'm not entirely sure where we're all coming from, but just to level set, probably an unnecessary slide, but just like a one slide, this is how federally subsidized housing in the US works at a very high level. That's my husband texting me. First, the mission of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, first and foremost, is to provide decent, safe, and affordable housing, mainly addressing kind of the rent burden affordability side of things. But there has been increasing attention over the last 30 years on the location of housing, which I'll get into in a minute. Oops, I did something bad. Okay. And the two, kind of programs that the two biggest HUD administered programs are public housing, which we really haven't built since around 1974, and the Housing Choice Voucher program, originally and often still called Section 8. And so this is the program that gives low-income renters a voucher that they can use towards rent on the private market. So renters have to go out, find a unit, find a landlord that's willing to take the voucher and a unit that passes HUD inspection, and then the voucher subsidizes their rents. And so a recent study by Ingrid Ellen and colleagues shows that only about 60% of voucher holders can actually find a unit to rent. The rest give their vouchers back. So, everything's going great. Part of the problem is that there's a limited supply of affordable units. And so the predominant supply side program, how we build affordable housing in the US, is actually now the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC program, which has produced, it's turning 40 this year, it's turned 3.5 million, it's produced 3.5 million units in its 40 years of existence. And so when you hear about affordable housing being built, odds are it's getting LIHTC funding. It's sort of our not only is it actually our predominant subsidized housing production program, it also accounts for a quarter of all new apartment production over the last 20 years, which is, sort of just an indictment about how little we build in the US. So we don't really build public housing anymore. Instead, we've switched to this tax credit model to produce affordable housing. I'll also just briefly say another important fact to keep in mind is that subsidized housing is not a guarantee in the US, and only about a quarter of eligible families actually get a housing subsidy. So how does LIHTC produce affordable housing? Unlike our other housing programs, LIHTC is administered by the IRS, our tax system, not HUD. So the IRS basically gives states tax credits purely based on population, not based on housing costs in the state, to allocate to fund affordable housing. States then develop regulations for their programs. Every state does something different. These are called the Qualified Allocation Plan, or QAP. And this reflects states' priorities around, where they think we need housing, what type of tenant to house, senior, family, something else, what type of developer to work with, nonprofit, for-profit, other considerations. And then private housing developers, both for-profit and nonprofit, are the ones that actually build the housing. So developers essentially are competing to win these tax credits by submitting applications for the projects that they want to build. States then score these proposals per the QAP. allocate tax credits to developers. And this is typically competitive. Often states, don't have enough funding to fund all the projects submitted. In recent years in California, it's been about half of projects that have actually been funded. So the projects with the highest scores kind of win. Developers then take the tax credits, they sell them to investors, and that's how they fund their projects rather than through rental income. Because in exchange for these tax credits, they're setting rents below market rent at a level affordable to low-income households for a long period of time. So federally, it's 30 years. In California, it's actually 55. So obviously, like super easy, what could go wrong here? I think the things to think about that I'll talk about today are mainly in kind of the state developing program regulations in terms of where they think housing should go and who housing should be affordable to. And then also the developers sort of putting together the projects, how are they putting them together in a way that they can make it work financially? And also, are there certain areas they kind of prefer to be developing in? So those are probably the parts of the process that the work will most directly relate to today. Okay, and so obviously one key aspect of building affordable housing is that it's located somewhere specific, right? It's not a voucher where the tenant is sort of choosing where to, or to the best of their ability, choosing with lots of constraints where to live. We're building affordable housing in a particular place. So historically, the public housing program built housing in already poor neighborhoods, often to replace, sort of blighted slum housing with higher quality housing. Over time, public housing kind of deteriorated, high-profile reports of social disorder, cost overruns in the public housing program. At the same time, in the 80s and 90s, we were moving towards kind of more neoliberal market-based policies, and research on the consequences of concentrated poverty, like Bill Wilson's The Truly Disadvantaged, were sort of becoming influential in policy circles. So kind of in the 90s, federal housing policy began to adopt this kind of poverty deconcentration paradigm, which resulted in several policy and program kind of changes and experiments, including the Moving to Opportunity housing experiment, which provided public housing residents with vouchers for use in low poverty neighborhoods. Hope 6, we've had some Hope 6 development here in LA that's still ongoing, even though the program doesn't exist anymore. Renaming the Section 8 program the Housing Choice Voucher Program to sort of emphasize this idea of people being able to choose to live in lower poverty neighborhoods. And then the LIHTC program's role in poverty deconcentration was really seen as this kind of place-based approach where rather than sort of trying to move people to lower poverty areas, we were going to put LIHTC in high poverty areas. And the hope was that by putting high quality, sort of affordable housing in neighborhoods, it could potentially bring in additional investment in the neighborhood and could lead to potential social change that brought higher income households into the area. Whether it did that or not, the impacts have been pretty small in past research. Over the past 10 to 15 years, we've had a little bit of a paradigm shift from focusing on poverty deconcentration to focusing on access to opportunity. And so here the focus is less on kind of neighborhood level, like deconcentrating poverty, and more on benefits for individual households. And so in recent years, we've seen programs like the Creating Moves to Opportunity Voucher Experiment, which provides voucher holders with actual real supports, housing navigators, information to kind of help them potentially move to a range of higher opportunity areas. And then in the LIHTC program, we've seen a shift from putting LIHTC in historically distressed places to building in higher opportunity places to provide low-income families the chance to live in those areas. And this has largely been achieved through the adoption of opportunity incentives and state QAPs. Okay, so as I said before, the QAP is kind of setting the scoring rules, who's going to win tax credits and build housing. And QAP has to address project location, like where housing should be built in some ways. And so these locational priorities, again, have kind of shifted from kind of a focus on investing in high poverty areas to kind of a dual goal of both continuing to do that, but also encouraging development in higher income or higher opportunity areas. These changes were accelerated by a Supreme Court ruling in 2015 that found that prioritizing low-income housing development in high poverty and majority Black neighborhoods perpetuated segregation and violated fair housing law. And policymakers were also influenced by social science research, like the maps that Raj Chetty and others have put out that I showed you earlier, that emphasize the importance of neighborhood opportunity for children. When I talked to the folks in California, these were sort of the two factors that they talked about in terms of why they made these policy changes. So by 2020, every state in DC includes some sort of incentive, either you're increasing the odds of winning the tax credits or you're getting more tax credits if you propose to develop on a high opportunity area. So how do we measure high opportunity area? I'm going to come back to that empirically, but these are kind of the common indicators. Okay, so do these incentives actually work? Have we seen this shift? Have we seen a shift in where developers are building? Generally, yes. Past descriptive work finds that in states that adopted opportunity incentives, there was a shift in the share of funded projects to lower poverty and more racially diverse neighborhoods. In a paper I wrote with my former student, Rebecca Smith, we sort of more directly evaluated the effect of California's opportunity incentives on development patterns and found that the share of large family new construction LIHTC developments in higher resource areas doubled after the QAP changes that incentivized development in these areas. Just to concretize this a little bit, in 2018, California developed an opportunity map to measure neighborhood opportunity for children. It scores every tract on economic, educational, and environmental resources. And if you're a developer and you propose to build in a high or highest resource area, which are the ones colored here in blue, you sort of get more points on your LIHTC application and more funding. So you increase the chances that you're going to win, basically. And the state also only focused on developments for families, like focused on housing for families with kids, given the importance of neighborhoods for children's development. So those were sort of the only ones that could get these incentives. And just to quickly show you what we found in this paper, we just did a kind of a difference in difference analysis predicting the probability of that a developer was going to propose to build in a higher resource area before in the white bars and after in the gray bars the incentives were introduced. And we compare, this is sort of the eligible development, so those for families with kids, and this is senior, permanent supportive housing, all other developments that this policy doesn't apply to. And so if the incentive was effective, we would see, you'd expect to see a much bigger change for these. This is the probability that a development is in one of these highest resource areas. We'd expect to see kind of a much bigger increase in this probability for these eligible properties versus ineligible. And that's what we see. Yeah.
What defines a family size unit?
Oh yeah, so the state defines this. It's developments where I think at least a quarter of the units have to have either 2+ or 3+. I think it's 2+ bedrooms, and they also have things like they're supposed to have things like playgrounds and sort of other amenities for families on site. But it's basically housing that's more than like studio kind of thing, something that's suitable for a family with kids. Yeah, good question. And then just more broadly in the LIHTC program nationally, we've seen this shift in development to lower poverty neighborhoods. So this table you can't read, that's fine. If you look at more recently developed projects, the share in tracts with poverty rates below 10% has gone up, and LIHTC is now less likely to be developed in predominantly racially minoritized and low-income neighborhoods. Okay, it's a lot of wind up. So the LIHTC program is increasingly focused on developing in high opportunity areas. And these incentives do seem to be guiding development. So there's a number of questions that remain to kind of fully understand the potential of LIHTC to both reduce housing affordability challenges and also increase access to opportunity. So do LIHTC program regulations accurately identify high opportunity areas? I briefly showed you this. This is what it looks like in LA. That might seem right to you. That might not seem right to you. Do LIHTC program regulations are we actually identifying high opportunity areas? And can low-income tenants actually live in these areas? Ironically, are affordable housing units actually affordable, basically, to low-income tenants, given the provisions of the LIHTC program? And then also, can we kind of help families become aware of and become interested in moving to neighborhoods that we think are advantageous? So I'm going to try to address these questions in my remaining time today. Okay, so to start, do LIHTC program regulations accurately identify high opportunity areas? So there's kind of two empirical questions here that I'm just going to give, sort of basic descriptive analyses to support or to try to answer. And so I'm just going to start with the first one. Do high opportunity classifications identify places where low-income children actually have better outcomes? So to address this, I'm drawing on data from the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and they basically looked at all states' QAPs and identified tracts in those states as, yes, this has been identified as a high opportunity area per this state's regulations, or no, it's not high opportunity. And so given the way some of these QAPs, when you read them, you can't actually map them onto census tracts, which are sort of common administrative units in quantitative urban analyses. And so there's 32 states that they can identify at the tract level, whether a tract is high opportunity or not. There's 2 that I think are problematic data-wise, so I dropped those. So I'm looking at 30 states for this analysis. And then I wanted to see, do these opportunity classifications actually predict upward mobility of low-income children as one outcome? There's lots of ways we think a neighborhood might affect us. This is one outcome. So I'm drawing on the data that I showed you in the map earlier from the Opportunity Atlas, which is a project by Raj Chetty and colleagues that uses IRS data and census data for everyone in the US born between 1978 and 1983, I think. I'm a Chetty kid. I know you were thinking I looked so much younger than that. But and then they look to see what their incomes were when they were 35. And they're able to say, okay, among kids growing up in this tract, this is sort of their predicted income in young adulthood. So just to show you how states are defining opportunity areas, it ranges a lot. So Alabama just says, is this census tract's median family income at or above the county's median? Great, it's a high income or it's a high opportunity area. Idaho is just like, hey, is this tract's poverty rate higher or lower than the state? If it's lower, that's a high opportunity area. And then there's states that are much more complex. So Connecticut sort of identifies in a similar way to California, very high opportunity tracts. So they're sort of throwing together median income, indicators of local school performance, unemployment rates, other employment kind of labor market indicators, crime. And then in California, there's sort of over 20 indicators that are kind of smashed together in economic, educational, and environmental domains. And they're smashed together. Every state or every tract is scored. And then within every county, the top 20% are considered highest opportunity, then high, et cetera. So again, this is just zooming in on where we are today. We provide no opportunity on the UCLA campus, but you can see that the surrounding areas, we're in a pretty high opportunity area. Although, I think when you start to look at this, you're like, okay, is that a meaningful distinction? We've got sort of, this would count as a high resource area that's incentivized, and then across whatever this dividing road is, that's low. And so I think when you start to look at these maps, you're like, I don't know. Okay, so this is forthcoming work in an article in the UC Law Journal. I compared the income percentile rank achieved by low-income kids who grew up in areas classified as high opportunity versus not high opportunity. And so if I just look at that across all states, the sort of mean income percentile rank difference is about 4 points between, there is an association. Children that grew up in these tracts that are considered high opportunity, are in their income rank in adulthood is about 4 percentage points higher. But there's a lot of variation by state. So this figure is showing you kind of the interquartile range from the 25th to the 75th percentile of the predicted income rank in these groups of tracts that are considered either high opportunity or not. So here in California, I think we're third down. There's like a little bit of overlap, but yeah, for the most part, sorry, I don't know why this figure is so wacky, but this should be fully black versus gray. So, there's a range, but growing up in neighborhoods considered high resource, produces better, higher income ranks in adulthood than places that are not given that classification. In places like Connecticut, below us, Maryland, I can't figure, maybe that's Maryland. There's kind of no overlap at all, and there's sort of a clear distinction. But then you have states like, New York, where I think that's New York, where sort of there's sort of complete overlap between the two sets of tracks. And, it's not as clear cut. So just zooming in on California, this was a memo I wrote to the California Department of Housing and Community Development, where I was comparing the California Opportunity Map and there's 5 categories in the map, and the Opportunity Atlas data. And so I'm just plotting kind of the distribution of the predicted income percentile rank a low-income kid reaches in adulthood, depending on where they grew up. So there's certainly, a positive correlation here. These 2 boxed categories on the right, these are the categories that are being incentivized in the state's QAP, and kind of the median income rank expected is higher than in the lower resource areas. But there's a lot of variation. And I'm not saying that like the Chetty data, oh no, what did I do? I'm giving away all my secrets. Okay, I'm not saying that the Chetty data is like what we should be basing policy on. But my point is that if we're going to incentivize the production of housing in high opportunity areas or in any area, like we better make sure we know where we're putting housing. And we need to make sure that we know how to identify high opportunity areas. And there's just a lot of variation in states in terms of how well that's going. Often they're sort of just looking at kind of the demographic characteristics of people that already live there and not necessarily kind of the structural or institutional or political resources that might actually be the mechanisms that facilitate upward mobility. Yes.
If you're going to talk about this later, don't answer. The previous one on the states, do you think it's because of the QAPs being different, or is there something about the tract level change in opportunity in those places?
You mean change from when like the Chetty data are being measured? Yeah. Yes.
No.
Yeah.
When they lived there 30 years
right.
ago.
Yeah, so I think yes, this is a critique of the Chetty map, right? Because as in order to know if kids do well, if they live in a certain area, you have to wait for the kids to grow up, right? And then, I grew up in a neighborhood that feels like frozen in time. So like my neighborhood's probably still similar to how it was when I was growing up there in the 80s and 90s, but there's other neighborhoods that have undergone a lot of change. So Chetty and colleagues do some validation. They look at a cohort of kids born a decade later, and they look at some of the tracked predictors of the strongest predictors of the income percentile ranks and sort of say they don't change. But I think that's a point for debate. So part of it could be, yes, maybe in some states that are undergoing more gentrification or hollowing out population wise or whatever the point may be, these, kind of might not be valid. Yeah.
Did you look at your ranking, your classification of how the QAP works with this as an outcome?
What do you mean?
Like the just income-based ones, how do they more complicated ones?
Yes, I have not done that yet, but yes, so sort of saying is Alabama doing just as good of a job as we are? I mean, this is a lot of stuff's happening there. I've written a memo about that too, but they've not called me back. Yeah,
if we like
maybe.
that outcome.
If we like that outcome. Yeah, maybe. Who can say? Yeah, it keeps a lot of task forces employed, and what could you always love a task force. Okay, so looking at neighborhood change in maybe a different way. So most states' regulations are classifying neighborhoods at a single point in time. Some of them reassess neighborhoods annually, which drives developers absolutely bonkers because it screws up often they're allowed to use the earlier version, but it can screw up their planning because what they thought was a high opportunity area, then the next year is not. But it also kind of reduces validity of the measures, right? Like if you're saying in 2026, this is a high opportunity area. In 2027, it is not. Like, what happened? Is there actually a change there? So generally, states are just doing this at one point in time, and very few states are considering kind of a longitudinal perspective on neighborhoods. And as we were just discussing, neighborhoods change. So a neighborhood with, say, a 15% poverty rate or whatever we think a low poverty rate is right now, but where poverty is rising, might be a very different neighborhood than a neighborhood where poverty has been stable or declining. And this was a problem a complication with the MTO experiment. So often if families were able to use their voucher to move to a low poverty neighborhood, that neighborhood was increasing in poverty, that this static measurement was missing. So with Carolina Reed and Quinn Underreiner at the Turner Center, we set out to understand how much neighborhoods are changing around LIHTC properties. And so I'll show you some results from a working paper. So we basically just took data from HUD on LIHTC tract locations, so the neighborhoods that they're located in. We looked at LIHTC properties in metropolitan areas across the US. I'm zooming out from, I guess that wasn't California either. I think I promised California, but it's coming. But all metropolitan areas in the US. And then we looked at how poverty rates as one indicator, again, of neighborhood resources or opportunity. I think there's debate on what we should be using, but we looked at poverty rates. And we wanted to see how they change, how neighborhoods changed around LIHTC development. So we looked at LIHTC developments that were built, that sort of came online, were placed in service between 1990 and 2009. And we stop in 2009 so that we can sort of see what happens kind of after the property is built. And so to be clear, we're not, there's been research trying to understand kind of the impact of LIHTC development on neighborhood poverty rates or on other neighborhood features. We're not trying to say that LIHTC is causing or not causing any neighborhood changes that we see. We're just making the point that, we need to pay attention to change for whatever reason it's happening. There's a large body of literature on LIHTC that sort of periodically kind of classifies neighborhoods according to, what poverty category they're in. And any change from like publication to publication, it's not clear. It's like, is that because we're changing where we're citing, or is that because the neighborhood is changing? So this is a beautiful transition chart that Quinn made that shows transitions among poverty categories that are kind of commonly used in social science research. So we typically think about neighborhoods with poverty rates below 10% as low poverty, between 10 and 20 as maybe moderate, 20 to 30, you're starting to get maybe high poverty, 30 to 40, and then 40 plus is typically considered like a concentrated poverty neighborhood. And so we're showing sort of how neighborhoods that include LIHTC properties transition in terms of neighborhood poverty from 2000 to 2023. So among neighborhoods with LIHTC, about 40%, less than 40% of low poverty. Wait, what does my notes here say? Okay. So among these neighborhoods, about 40% of the low poverty areas and more than half of like the high poverty areas experience some change in poverty category. In many states, LIHTC neighborhoods actually experience more kind of dynamic poverty rate changes than neighborhoods without LIHTC, which again, we're not sort of interested in like a causal comparison there, but it is interesting to know that LIHTC neighborhoods maybe seem particularly dynamic. And so this sort of just kind of, yes, there's sort of the majority of neighborhoods that are low poverty stay low poverty. We know this is kind of sticky, but about 40% of them are going somewhere else. And so I think this raises the issue of how are we accounting for neighborhood dynamics when designating areas as high opportunity. And it's, if you try to validate them against outcomes like I was doing earlier, again, that's tricky because you kind of have to wait for kids to grow up. But LIHTC is keeping people in place for, sort of 30 to 55 years. Like that's the lifespan of the project. And so if we're going to keep people in neighborhoods for a certain amount of time, we kind of need to know how dynamic those neighborhoods are. So that was sort of the purpose of this paper. Yes, my interlocutor, do you have another comment?
Did you take out the number of people that moved into the LIHTC?
No, we're not trying to kind of net out, is it due to like the actual building or not? Yeah, I look forward to your follow-up paper. But that's not what we're doing. It was clarifying, but it's just not for me. Okay. So there's been a move to, it's all good. There's been a move to produce more LIHTC properties in high opportunity areas. And so who actually can live in LIHTC? Like, are the lowest income tenants able and interested in living in these places? So this motivates a few empirical questions. Are LIHTC units affordable? Is subsidized housing actually affordable to low-income tenants? Does this unit affordability vary by, even if they're flawed or not flawed, neighborhood opportunity level? Because one concern we might have would be, if we're building LIHTC units in, high opportunity areas, but then low-income people still can't afford to live in them, like the impact is muted. So this is a California analysis in part due to data availability. And so when a developer assembles a LIHTC property, they're setting the rents for the units. And there can be a mix of rents, which I'll talk about next. And so data on LIHTC projects rent, I'm going to say targets, and I'll explain why. And the project location come from the state's Housing Finance Agency, TCAC, which oversees this program. They published this data for projects funded from 2011 to 2023. It's about half of all currently active LIHTC projects in California. There's just not data available for that, unfortunately, that I know of, but please tell me if you know of it. I'm going to describe some variation by neighborhood opportunity category, which I've already discussed. And then I'm also going to look at income on people currently living in LIHTC. And so historically, this was not collected because the program isn't a HUD program and the IRS was not interested or able to collect those data. But since 2008, state housing finance agencies are supposed to report tenant information to HUD. The data are imperfect. So, Californians are actually not bad. There's other states that are like, we are not going to report, we dare you to do something. Californians are not bad, but just kind of grain of salt with the income results. Okay, so there are requirements. As I said before, developers have to set rents at a level that's affordable to low-income households in order to qualify for the tax credits. But there's a kind of a range of what low income means. And so rent setting is based on income limits published by HUD. People earning up to 80% of the median income in the area, what's called area median income, are eligible to live in LIHTC. So here's just examples from HUD. They look at the Los Angeles, Long Beach, Glendale area. And so they look at AMI. This is what 80%, and it's also based on family size. So this is for families of 4, yeah. So this is sort of what the income limit would be for households of 4 earning up to 80%, AMI, 50% and 30%. And they call these low income, very low income, and extremely low income families. And so then based on those income limits, they basically set the rents based on what can people at this top income limit afford and not exceed that 30% of monthly income threshold. So basically, how can we not rent burden these people? And it's important to note that units are developed and rents are set based on these AMI calculations, not of the individual household that might be renting, right? So for the voucher program and for public housing, for example, a family their rent would be based on their own income. Like no family would be paying more than 30% of their own income for rent. In LIHTC, it's based on these area, limits. And so, if you are earning 30% AMI, you can apply to live in one of these, more expensive units. You're just going to be you're going to be rent burdened because you're going to be paying more than 30% of your monthly income. So it's something that I'll talk more about as we go and when I show you the comparison to tenants' incomes. So developers decide on the mix of kind of rent targeting. So they're setting it sort of targeted at either a low income, very low income, or extremely low income family based on these sorts of calculations, depending on where the project is. And they're trying to figure out how to make the project work based on, what other funding they can get, if they're, interested in a particular population, formerly unhoused people versus seniors versus something else, financial constraints, et cetera. This is, if you just want to feel sad or a little better about not living in San Jose, you can. And then Tulare, yeah, yes.
Are these the boundaries for which these are Los Angeles? I mean, it's a huge boundary, right?
Yes, yeah. So, yes. So HUD uses like metropolitan area boundaries, and they don't even use LA County. They do, or is that like, I don't know, but it's sort of a big area, right? So for something like vouchers, we're moving into things like small area rents that are based on small area fair market rents, which are based on zip code. But no, this is sort of depending on how the metro is defined for the area, they're metro-wide. Yeah. Yeah. And there's obviously lots of variation in terms of how much it might cost to build something in different parts of the area. Okay, so this is the distribution of LIHTC units developed in California from 2011 to 2023 by their rent targeting. So this is a recently online paper in housing policy debate. If you're interested, the bottom portion represents units developed with rents targeted at extremely low income households, so folks earning 30% or less of area median income. The middle swath is for the very low income folks between 30 and 50%. And then low income, where they're still low income, they're at 80% of area median income down to 50%, but they're kind of the highest income of the eligible households. And yes, so go ahead.
Say that those portions set by the providers of the low income housing tax credit, and then in aggregate they meet them, or is there some triage that happens between what developers put up and what is like? How does that process work? You can get the outcome you aim at.
Yes. So the Classifications in terms of these households, that's set by HUD. In terms of what developers choose to put in their buildings, that's kind of a dance between maximizing the points they can get in the QAP. So sometimes the QAP will say, wait, we'll give you more points, sort of if you can develop for the lowest income possible households. But you can still win tax credits and you can still get full points if you don't do that. And so then the developer's thinking about this balance of how can I kind of maximize my chances of getting funding, but also make this thing affordable, because they're getting sort of tax credits on the front end to develop. And then they've got to figure out how to fund the project, and they're funding it through these, sort of reduced rents. And so they're trying to figure out how that can pencil. But there's not kind of a prescribed, every building should be, this, this, and this. Does that answer your question? Okay, I think maybe we'll continue to get there, hopefully. Okay, so we see this trend towards developing for extremely low income households. And so in 2023, about 25% of units developed were for ELI households in that year. But the biggest chunk, 43%, is for kind of the low income, but highest of the low income families. I'm trying to do a little research brief on this in terms of what's going on in Los Angeles. And so I made this figure, whatever the day before I had to send Georgie my slides was, but this is sort of that same line we just saw for California. And then this kind of dotted line is the county and the dashed line is the city. And so you can see that in 2023, the city and the county or in the city and the county, a higher share of ELI is being developed. HHH probably has something to do with that. Sort of LIHTC also, the application process, you're looked upon favorably if you have matching local funds. And the focus here in LA County has been for formerly unhoused, sort of permanently supportive housing. And so that might be why we see kind of a big increase here. Yeah.
Is City of LA in the dashed line, is the county line excluding the city?
Oh yeah, sorry, good question. No, the dotted line is inclusive of the city. Yeah, it's not like non-LA. Yeah, yeah.
187 cities.
Correct. Yes, I could do that, but I have not. But yeah, this is sort of inclusive of that. Yeah. So, okay. And then I was interested in, okay, are units affordable to tenants of different income levels distributed kind of differently or similarly across these opportunity areas? And as I said before, you might be worried that developers are putting kind of all of their low income targeted, highest of the low income targeted units in high opportunity areas. They'll take in the most rent that way. Maybe they need it to build in that area or to support the property after being built in that area. And that could maybe mitigate some of the kind of social integration goals that the state has and is as reflected in the opportunity map. But it's actually an okay news story. So this figure shows the distribution of units targeted at each income level. So where are the ELI units? Where are the very low income units? Where are the low income units? Sort of shaded by the opportunity area according to the state's map. So about 20%, these bottom two categories are the high and highest resource areas. So about 20% of units affordable to each group are in those higher, highest resource areas. So there's not a huge inequality there. There's a slightly higher share of ELI units in areas that the state classifies as being highly segregated and high poverty. But overall, there are opportunities for the lowest income units to live in higher opportunity areas. Of course, if this was representative, 40% of tracts are in these categories. So this should be up here, but one thing at a time. Okay, so next I'm going to turn my attention to whether or not LIHTC tenants can actually afford to live in LIHTC. So again, LIHTC rents are set according to these percentages of local area income levels, not the income of the household. And so the bar on the left, this is sort of an imperfect comparison because the bar on the left shows that it's looking at all active LIHTC projects in California, averaged from 2018 to 2022. You can see that about half of current LIHTC tenants are extremely low income, right? This is a program sort of serving the lowest income folks. But in contrast, what we have developed from 2011 to 2023, when I have the data, only about 15% of those units. This is sort of smashing that sort of area graph into just one, not looking at it over time. So only about 15% of those units were ELI targeted. And again, I don't have in here the units developed before 2011. I don't have a reason to think necessarily there's way more ELI units in there, but caveat, I can not sort of a direct comparison. So this is like a huge mismatch in the affordability of affordable housing and who is actually living in these units. And so it suggests that like these tenants are either potentially doubling up and actually using a housing voucher in a LIHTC unit, which is allowed and actually encouraged. Developers really like that. Or they're just severely rent burdened. They're paying, if we think back, I forget what the LA County numbers are, but you have an ELI family that theoretically can afford $1,000 and now they're paying $1,900 and they're like trying to make it work somehow. It's actually even worse nationally. Among LIHTC units that received tax credit funding in 2023, 2/3 were for low income households as opposed to about 40% in California, even though nearly 60% of LIHTC tenants were extremely low income as of 2021. So there's big mismatch kind of in this program, and LIHTC is not sort of a deep enough subsidy to actually kind of make it work for the lowest income families. Yes. Sure. So let's see, let me get my numbers right. In 2023, 66% of LIHTC units were aimed at kind of people in that low income category, but kind of the opposite, 60% of tenants were extremely low income. So it's kind of this like 2/3 are for the highest income folks, but 2/3 of folks are lowest income. Does that make sense? Okay, yeah. Okay, so the last thing I want to tell you is very much in progress, but I think it's interesting. So increasing supply in high opportunity neighborhoods may not be enough to actually increase the odds that low-income families find these units. So we actually don't know a ton about how people find LIHTC units. They are not run by a housing authority. Up until what I'm about to tell you, they weren't centrally advertised. It's a private developer who's marketing it just like they would any other apartment building. There's a paper by Carolina Reed showing that, and I forget how many buildings, in a small sample, but interesting sample of California LIHTC properties, most people living there found out about the unit because they walked by it. So that's, going to have implications for who actually ends up living in these neighborhoods. And past research on housing search and segregation processes suggest that people's information about neighborhoods beyond their own and beyond where their network lives is like pretty limited. So again, if we're trying to sort of make headway on access to opportunity, desegregation, we might have to change the way we advertise. So this is in progress work evaluating whether centrally listing LIHTC units rather than developers just listing their units individually increases access to neighborhood opportunity. So I'm working with Dan Rinsler and Matt Alvarez-Nissen at the California Housing Partnership, and we're evaluating a centralized online listing platform for affordable housing in the Bay Area that's called Doorway. This is what it looks like. Ultimately, listing your property on Doorway is going to be required of any developer, any property that's getting LIHTC funding, and also I think any funding from the state, if they keep changing if that's true or not. So this was launched in 2023, and the idea is if we put, if someone's looking for affordable housing, can they just be referred to this website and then it's all there rather than having to find out about individual units? So we are working with a large developer who gave us all of their application data. We're recruiting more developers, but right now this represents about 7% of LIHTC properties in the 8 counties that are included in the service area. And because they don't have to put their properties online yet, on Doorway yet, we can compare units that are and aren't listed on Doorway to try to see if we can figure out kind of a difference there. For this particular developer, even for properties that are not listed on Doorway, their application process is like entirely online. So because we were worried like, well, is this some like digital divide story and sort of certain households are not accessing this. And that's certainly true for other developers. For this particular developer, it seems like we looked, and the people that apply via Doorway versus just their traditional method, which is also online, have very similar incomes, racial composition, et cetera. I was talking to another developer the other day who was like, well, you could have our data, but it's all just printed out in banker's boxes. And I was like, I will get on a flight and I will scan those applications. But I would imagine that there we'll have to think more carefully about, moving to Doorway is kind of a big deal for them. Learned a lot about developers' data systems, and the news is not good. So just, very preliminary finding, about 71% of applications submitted via Doorway are in the high or highest resource areas, compared to about 59% that were submitted outside of Doorway. And this is not due to a difference in location between the properties that were and weren't listed on Doorway. This developer happens to do a lot of development in higher resource areas, and about 60% of the properties in each category are in higher highest resource areas. I think I'll skip this, but this last thing is just, we can see people have to indicate their address that they currently live in. And so we were interested in, are you applying to a property that's further away from where you currently live? If you're able to find out about it on Doorway. Yeah, Kate.
How does the developer decide what?
Yeah, so we're making the case that it's plausibly random. Reviewers may not agree with us, but so it's basically sort of, did the IT team have capacity at that moment to help the property manager put it online? There's some bias towards like newer buildings or buildings that are sort of doing a full lease up. They'll sort of put all of those online. So we're trying to think about how to mitigate that. But for the most part, they're not like targeting certain developments towards Doorway. And eventually they're all going to have to be on here. But we're trying to kind of leverage this moment when they're not. But yes, sociological research on housing search shows that people are often kind of circumscribed within like a small set of neighborhoods when they're thinking about where to live. You think about your own, knowledge of LA neighborhoods. You might know more about certain places than others, and they might be closer to you. So what we found, we're looking at the distance between where people are applying from and where they're applying to live. And so we find that among the Doorway applicants, there's sort of a median distance between where you currently live and where you're kind of willing to live. That's about twice as big as in the non-Doorway applications. And so again, we're kind of taking this as evidence that potentially centrally listing units on Doorway, people like are interested in potentially moving far away. They might just not know about that opportunity. Okay, so I'm gonna wind us down now. If the goal, and there's an if there, we'll talk about in the next slide, is helping low-income people access affordable housing in higher opportunity areas, policymakers have to know how to identify those areas. I think generally they are identifying places where children do better, at least per those Chetty data, which, debatable whether we think that's correct or not. There is some variation across states, and neighborhoods change, which is a problem for this framework, I think. We have to incentivize developers to actually build affordable housing in those areas, which some of my past work has shown is working. And we have to ensure that tenants can afford and can apply to these units. And so I think in California and nationally, LIHTC is not affordable to the lowest income households, even though they make up the biggest majority of tenants. And also, as I was just saying, providing centralized information about LIHTC units can help families potentially move to higher opportunity areas. There actually are what are called affirmative marketing requirements for LIHTC properties. They're supposed to advertise their properties in a way that is in line with fair housing goals and affirmatively furthering fair housing. They do not. So kind of thinking about bigger implications. So LIHTC is one of these like bipartisan supported programs that actually there was federal legislation passed, I think last year, what is time in this administration, but that is expected to actually increase LIHTC production. So if LIHTC is going to become even more of the predominant funding source, there's still lots of questions we have to think about. And so I think a big one is where should we build affordable housing, right? So I think there are trade-offs in investing in places that need investment, right? So there are neighborhoods of concentrated poverty where there are a lot of low-income people who are severely rent burdened, and having housing affordability in that neighborhood would potentially be helpful, versus moving people to opportunity. And this is, a very old question in housing policy debate, and thinking about, should we invest in people, invest in places and people, but invest in places or move people. When I was doing interviews with LIHTC developers about the opportunity areas, you know, a couple of them they were like, well, this is just redlining again. Like we're literally drawing, I guess it's green lining or blue lining or whatever the state's colors are, but it's literally sort of outlining places that are low opportunity and saying we shouldn't invest there. And so I think figuring out like what's the right balance, and to be clear, not 100% of LIHTC is going into these high opportunity areas. So what's the right, you know, is there a cap, which there is right now, but like, is there a cap? Is there a right limit? And that varies a lot state by state. Sometimes I think rather than get tied up, like we should maybe just, you know, focus on housing affordability and rental availability, which overlaps a lot with opportunity in some cases, but it sort of avoids these like more normative judgments. And instead we should just say like, our goal is to build affordable housing everywhere, to give people choice as to where they want to live, make it affordable. What neighborhoods don't have multifamily? What neighborhoods don't have rental? What neighborhoods don't have affordable rental? So I don't know. That's something I've been thinking about a little bit. And then who should LIHTC be affordable to? And again, I think there's trade-offs here, right? So do we want, you know, the way LIHTC is sort of working now, it's kind of providing like a shallower subsidy so that most of the units are only affordable to people in kind of that 50 to 80% AMI range. If we go really deep and provide units that are accessible and affordable to ELI families, we're going to, you know, unless we allocate even more dollars, it's going to be fewer units. If households have to use vouchers in order to afford LIHTC, there's sort of this debate about, you know, kind of complementarity versus substitution. Like if one family is kind of doubling up on their subsidy, they're getting a lot of help and they're, you know, able to not be rent burdened, but then we're helping one family instead of helping two families a little bit. And like, these are just debates that I don't have the answer to, but I hope that you do. And I look forward to any remaining questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Whitney. And thank you so much, Anne. You all see very clearly why we worked to wrestle you away from USC for about a decade, and we're finally
third time's the charm. Yeah.
very happy that we've been successful. I feel also very validated by this last slide because about 15 slides ago, I started to form this question, and you started in this slide. I really feel like you started to get to it, and it goes like this. So, you know, especially kind of where you're talking about this alternative approach, you know, focusing on housing affordability, you know, without getting too deep into abstractions about LIHTC. I mean, I think that LIHTC has now gotten to this, to become this behemoth that is shouldering a burden that it was never intended to, right? Like this was a, you know, part of the 1986 Tax Reform Act. You know, this little bit, this little tax credit that got created and is now our housing subsidy production vehicle, right? It's our public housing, you know, that's what it is. And so I don't want to I don't want to start layering more like things onto it, but like I can't help but when I see the Los Angeles map and it's, you know, kind of a donut, you know, and there's this huge, like low opportunity-ish area in the middle. And all of us who, you know, study Los Angeles know that there's a lot of variation in those neighborhoods. And most specifically, there's a lot of neighborhoods in there where like multifamily investment is happening, right? And there's multifamily production being targeted to these neighborhoods that like some of us get, you know, kind of concerned about because that, you know, might be either a, you know, symptom or, you know, accelerant for gentrification. And like, you know, I think the point that you're making here is really valid where like we need to focus on like, where is housing available? Where is it not? You know, where do we need people to have, you know, basically below market rate options? And so what I worry about is that in this race to avoid, in this race to put, you know, subsidized housing in, you know, opportunity areas, you're only allowing market rate housing in these neighborhoods where we know like affordability concerns are rising pretty quickly. And that's where people currently live and they want to stay, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess that's like an invitation to maybe expand on that, you know, kind of thinking about like neighborhood change specifically in those places.
Yeah, no, I think this is like the thing we have not nailed yet among many things. But I think first to the point about kind of like this is like the little program that could or that should, right? We layer everything. We expect higher compliance with like ADA requirements. I have talked to developers who are like, we are not building a senior or kind of special needs unit, and we have to make everything wheelchair accessible, which there's nothing wrong with that, but other buildings are not required to do that. They're required to maybe make some units that, and instead they have to like move people out, make counters 1 inch lower, like move everyone back in. So they have to sort of meet kind of high requirements in terms of environmental. Everything's like LEED certified, which is like great, but you know, there's a headline every like 2 years in the LA Times about how it costs $1 million to build 1 unit of subsidized housing in California, and like, yeah, because it costs $1 million to build anything in California. So I think it is and now it's affordable. It has to meet integration goals. It has to serve this population and this population. It's our cure for homelessness, even though no recently unhoused person can pay these rents, right? And so totally echoing that. I think one challenge is like there seems to just be sometimes to me like a lack of alignment with other state priorities and other housing programs, because the opportunity map is sort of agnostic to what the land in these neighborhoods is actually zoned to do. And so there's a lot of high opportunity areas that a LIHTC developer is never going to look at because it's a zoning fight that they do not want to have. And when I was doing developer interviews, I thought they were going to talk a lot more about zoning as a kind of a barrier. And they were just like, oh, we don't even like, I'm not going to spend 2 years of my life trying to get a piece of land rezoned because there's enough land kind of elsewhere. So I've tried to do a little bit of analysis of like where those kind of magic places are that are both high opportunity and zoned. And I think like that's interesting to think about how that's guiding development into certain places. I mean, at the end of the day, it seems like we just need kind of a more coherently balanced portfolio where we're thinking about, okay, like we need development everywhere. And so what's like a 10-year plan where we think about kind of regionally within the city in comparison with market rate being built, in, you know, relationship to zoning, in relationship to climate goals. Like a lot of the high opportunity areas are not near transit. So then if you put people there, either they don't have a way to work, or they have to buy a car, and that's inconsistent with like vehicle mile traveled goals and things like that. So like, I think on the one hand, that would complexify things more to kind of have to take all these things into account, but we're implicitly asking the program to do that anyway. And so is there kind of a clearer framework that's like a balance where, you know, I don't know what the right number is. A third is targeted to this, a third to this, a third to this. I don't know. Yeah.
Questions?
Yeah, Kat.
Super helpful talk.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about this really interesting imbalance between the sort of unit mix and the tenant income distribution. And we talked about a little bit about the role of tenant choice or tenant selection of which properties they want to apply to. But I'm curious if you're in your work with talking to developers or like your deep understanding of the LIHTC policy and housing, fair housing rules, et cetera. You know much about the role of like the discretion of developers in selecting among applicants? Like, is that part of this equation and something that we should be changing policy around too?
Yes, but I don't know how yet. So that's what I'm doing this summer. So we have developer data so we can see who's applying. We're trying to get the data on who actually leases up. We've been told that these are two systems that do not speak to each other. So I think I can make them speak to each other, but they have to give me the data. So I'll be able to hopefully trace quantitatively, like what does the application pool look like? And then what does the actual tenant pool look like? We could do a little bit of like, how does the tenant pool or the application pool compare to existing tenants right now? They can give us those data. And those are actually reported to the state, although they're a little sketchy. But what I think is going to be more helpful is I'm doing interviews with tenant managers this summer. And so, because I want to know, like, if an extremely low income family comes to you and says, hey, I'm applying to this unit, it's actually targeted for an 80% AMI family, but like there is nothing else I can even in the ballpark afford. So like, I want to live here. I don't know what the tenant manager does is like normatively, morally supposed to do. Cause like on the one hand, you're like, yeah, live in this unit. You're going to be rent burdened. But on the other hand, if you turn them away, where are they supposed to go? And so my plan right now is to talk to kind of people at like the manager director level. And also some developers do this in-house. Some of them contract out to like John Stewart and other companies. So I want to talk to kind of like the policy setters to be like, what are the criteria? What the developer whose data we have was like, oh, well, like once people are qualified, then it's just a lottery. And I was like, the word qualified is doing like a lot of work there. So I want to talk to kind of the policy setters of when you have this application batch, what is qualified? Like, how do you make that? And then at the building level, talk to the people actually on the ground to be like, what's actually happening? And like in this scenario, because I mean, all of these LIHTC, like there's a huge mismatch. So this must be happening a lot. Like, what is the decision calculus? How does that vary across developers? So TBD, but yeah, it's super important. Yeah, Sam.
Somewhat so.
Oh, I'll allow it.
Yeah, sorry. We have a study on permanent supportive housing. I
Yep.
was just curious if you know of any sources that have looked at the geographic distribution of LIHTC, especially post 2015 and PSH recently, because I was looking at the map and I was like, I plotted like the housing, the housing basically report that LA puts out every year, where they've increasingly now have the PSH addresses actually in there for site-based at least. And it's kind of like a little bit of the inverse, except for there are some areas where it seems like there is a lot of LIHTC and PSH. So I was just curious if you know anything about that or could speak to it. And if not, no worries. I just kind of want to look into it.
Yeah, so I have not mapped that. I think, but one like additional debate in this space is, so some states, when they're doing QAP incentives, it's for every type of project. So PSH, seniors, families. California focused on families with kids. So another thing I didn't say, because it wasn't super relevant for this, is the LIHTC program is actually two programs at different levels of subsidy, a 4% and a 9%. The 9% is the most relevant in terms of competition. The 4% is more like bonds and sort of everyone gets it. And so they actually in California in 2020, because the bond program historically was not competitive, in 2020 it was. And so they put the opportunity incentives into the bond program for all types of projects. And I actually was on a call sometime that I can remember, so it must have been recently, where there is ongoing debate. Actually, Mike, you were on this email. Was it a call or was it an email? When Dan Rinsler wrote us and was like, hey, should senior and permanent supportive housing, like what should like an opportunity index look like for those types of properties? Because on the one hand, you don't want to perpetuate poverty concentration broadly. On the other hand, if I'm 86, my school district probably doesn't really matter. And so like, what's the right thing? So, but there's some states that the incentives that they put in apply to all properties. So I actually have not recently looked, or I haven't looked, or if I have, I've forgotten at sort of the distribution by type. But I have all the data to do it if we can talk about it. Yeah. Thoughts, suggestions? Anyone want to solve the housing crisis? Yeah, Kate, you're volunteered.
Question, not solving the housing crisis. I was wondering, also kind of a selfish question. Do you know if transit-oriented incentives have sort of changed the geography of LIHTC in California or other states that are doing a lot of this?
No, I have not really looked at the intersection between those programs. There are states that have like proximity to transit as one of their indicators of opportunity. But I have not looked at that systematically. So yeah, I don't have and I haven't like plotted on a map sort of TOD location versus, I don't know if you had any reactions since you spent a lot more time looking at like the TOC stuff than I have, but.
Some developers are going after both.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The rollout of these programs would maybe shift where LIHTC goes, right?
That sounds like a good hunch, but I haven't looked at it. Yeah. Yeah, Jennifer, and yeah.
So I have a question around the doubling up that you mentioned.
Yes.
So with the Section 8 or housing voucher and the LIHTC,
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any more information on that? Or does that also fall under like the discretionary role of the tenant manager? I guess I'm just curious about how people or like the bureaucratic sort of system decides to either allow the doubling up or
Yeah.
not. And then what's
Yeah.
the consensus?
Yeah, good question. So there's been some, first, I would say there's a good paper in the past couple of years, I think by Clayton Childress, about the frequency with which vouchers are being used in LIHTC, which was sort of data that was kind of nebulous before that. So I can follow up if I'm getting that citation wrong. But so a couple of things. So generally, work by Philip Bowden and Eva Rosen in sociology sort of has shown how like landlords often don't want voucher tenants in sort of the units where they think they can get market rate tenants, but in sort of their maybe like least desirable, often higher crime or neighborhoods where they're having a hard time renting out, like they're happy to take voucher tenants, and often they'll jack the price up to whatever the limit is. So I think we know that and as I said before, there's recent work showing it varies a lot by place, and I don't have LA's number at my fingertips, but kind of the average across places is that about 40% of voucher users can't find a place to live. So LIHTC, I think, is actually seen as like a potential like solution to this, because my impression from just talking to a few people is that tenant managers in LIHTC properties they don't have the same sorts of like, they're just sort of more in the affordable housing, fair housing space, and they don't have the kind of like prejudice again. I mean, this broad strokes here, but they may not have some of the same kind of prejudices that like private market landlords do. They're very familiar with the program. They know their units are going to meet the inspection. So I think that for the most part, it's encouraged. I mean, I think also the developers, I was talking to people that were like, we wish we could sort of guarantee that voucher holders could live in our units, and then we could take that to a bank basically and say we have this guaranteed revenue stream, and like it would be helpful on like their underwriting terms. And sometimes there's actually housing authorities that are now LIHTC developers, and sometimes they'll convert some of their vouchers to project-based vouchers to try to do this. But anyway, all that to say, I don't have a great hunch of how it's actually kind of working on the ground, and like if a family's coming to you with a voucher, is that a plus? Is that a minus? Is that a neutral? So that's something I hope to learn. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm quite new to this area, and it's a bit of a bird's eye question.
Sure.
First, fantastic work. And when I look at what you describe on its own terms, what I see is a striking success story of being able to create new housing that helps move people to opportunity. That's the good news. But now here's the question. This is the biggest subsidy program that's there, but relative to the magnitude of the housing crisis for extremely low income, it's a bit of a boutique program.
For sure.
And so my big question then becomes one, by focusing on the specific initiatives like this one, are we in some sense singing ourselves a lullaby at the same time as the bigger issue is one that just only touches on the margin? I'm just curious to hear you speak.
Yeah, what a beautiful question. Yeah, absolutely. So on the one hand, LIHTC is our biggest production program. On the other hand, it's like less than 4% of housing units, or something. Probably even less than that. That's the number I have in my head. Probably
like 20% of multi.
But 20% of multifamilies in the last quarter. So again, it's like kind of a glass is half empty, half full kind of thing, where like we should not pretend that we are fully funding a public or social housing program that actually meets needs. A quarter of families that are eligible, are actually getting subsidies. So in the developer data we looked at of properties listed on Doorway, this developer had, or no, I think this was all together, so maybe in and out of Doorway. The developer had about 70 buildings many of which were just listing a couple units at a time. I don't have the unit number off the top of my head, but in the 18 months of data that we have, there's over 100,000 applications. And so like the need is huge. You know, you hear every time a public housing authority opens the voucher wait list, it's like, you know, people wait in line all day. It's tens of thousands of people that get on it. So this is the program we have now. Is it the program we should have? Should instead we have social housing? You know, I'm not an urban economist in terms of efficiencies. I don't know. Sometimes I'm like, you know, that 5-box, you know, little or however many boxes it is, I have to, my slide that I use every time to explain the LIHTC program. Should there be one box where it just says give people money? Like, is that, you know, I actually don't think so, because I think the housing market would do weird things in reaction to that. But there's probably better models. You know, at this point, every California state housing policymaker has gotten a free trip to Vienna, right? Like that we know that there's like, I'm still waiting for the call. Hello, I'm available. Japan, I'm going in 2 weeks. I can get that subsidized. So Singapore, right? So we know, like, we choose this, right? Like not we, because I didn't choose it, but as a country, like this is what we've chosen for our social safety net. So we can unchoose it, but we haven't. Yeah. I think there's one question in the back if we have time, and then we can get kicked out. Yeah.
Thank you so much. In your conversations and in sharing your research, have people mentioned at all reducing that LIHTC rent schedule instead of from 30% of people's income to any percentage lower than that? And I know that that could be also connected to just a growing, especially in California, a growing issue of rental arrears, and how, as your data highlights, that people are living in low-income units and being ELI, and maybe that, like, reducing those overall percentages being something to address that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I am not aware of conversations around that. We've sort of and other folks may be more knowledgeable. We sort of chose that 30% rent burden kind of a long time ago, and it's what we're sticking with. And it doesn't always work because, you know, it's not flexible in terms of your income. If you're a very high income person, you can probably afford to spend way more than 30% if you want to, because you've got sort of the cash to buy your other things. If you're if you're making a very small amount of money, like 30% is still not going to leave you with enough to get by for your other expenses. So I'm not aware of conversations around that. In terms of arrears, this is something else I hope to talk to tenant managers around, because I don't have a great sense, other people might, of like, what do evictions look like in LIHTC? What happens when people, because incomes have to be recertified. So if you sort of surpass that limit, like, are you out immediately? Like, I actually don't, I don't know. So these are things I hope to talk to people about. I'm also editing a special issue of Housing Policy Debate about LIHTC, and we have a paper in there about rental arrears that I haven't read yet, but I'm sure it's great. So when that comes out, maybe I'll learn from that. Yeah.
One more question. Let's go. One more question. It wasn't green yet. Now it's green.
Oh, sorry. Where does the conversation on like there being a lot of expiring covenants with the LIHTC program go?
Yeah, great question. So as I said, LIHTC is turning 40, and a lot of these, you said the expiring covenants, right? That's what you said. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I have not. There have been people who have looked at that. I have not, and I know there's literature on it that I'm woefully unfamiliar with. So I think like Vincent Rena has done work on that. I don't actually know if you have a top line. Is the news good or bad? Like what happens when things expire? Probably not great, but I don't actually know.
Yeah, it certainly varies, property by property. For the most part, there's decent options to extend those covenants. And most are still ahead of us. Certainly, I mean, there's way more covenants ahead of us than are like currently expiring now, but it is happening, especially for the ones that, were still like 15-year covenants. The vast majority are at least 30.
Yeah.
But as it's a 40-year program, that's happening. But it is cheaper to extend
Yes.
those covenants
To
to
build
build
them.
new housing. And so it should always be a priority for policymakers and planners to like, be creative about extending those.
Yeah.
All right. I think our lease is probably about up in this here unit. So thank Anne again, please. And thank you for coming.